Before he goes ahead with his presentation, let me just do a brief introduction of Dr. Jared Rubin. He is an economic historian interested in political and religious economies of the Middle East and Western Europe. His research focuses on historical relationships between political and religious institutions and their role in economic development. His book, How the World Became Rich, The Historical Origins of Economic Growth with Mark Koyama, the one that he's going to talk about today, explores the many theories of why modern economic growth happened when and where it did. His book, Rulers, Religions, and Riches, Why the West Got Rich and the Middle East Did Not. It was back in 2017, Cambridge University Press, studied the role of Islam and Christianity played in long-term reversal of fortunes between the economies of the Middle East and the West and Western Europe. It received Best Book awards from Economic History Association and Society of Institutional and Organizational Economics. Dr. Rubin is the co-director of Chapman University's Institute for the Study of Religion, Economics, and Society, president of the Association of Study of Religion, Economics, and Culture, and serves on numerous editorial boards. He graduated with a PhD in economics from Stanford University and a BA from University of Virginia. And this was a brief introduction. I've been a fan of Dr. Rubin's writing and his scholarly work. And it's wonderful, Dr. Rubin, to have you with us. And please go ahead with your presentation.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Shahid. This is a real treat to be able to do this. If you do see me drinking coffee, it is 7 a.m. here, but it is, yeah, I'm very, very happy to be here and to talk about this book. Okay, so yeah, as that nice introduction just noted, this presentation will be about a book that just came out in May called How the World Became Rich. It's with Mark Koyama, who's an economic historian at George Mason University, right around Washington, D.C. And what this book attempts to do is it attempts to do many things. The first thing it tries to do is explain the theories of why the world became rich. This has been something that economists, political scientists, and particularly economic historians, those with interest in history, have been thinking about for over a century now. And there's been a variety of different ideas on why this came to pass. And if you're wondering, is the world really rich? I'm going to show you in a second that, yeah, it is. Obviously, there is a lot of poverty in the world. And this is something that Mark and I are very clearly aware of. But it's also the type of thing where the world is much richer than it has ever been, and alleviating the remaining poverty in the world. In order to do that, we do need to understand the mechanisms through which the world has become rich. Now, as I just noted, there's a lot of research that has been done, really over the last century, but really in the last 20 years, as new sources of data have become available, as we have more and more computing power to really analyze these data. And there's been a number of different takes on why this is the case. So the first half of this book, what it does is it overviews this literature. And there are multiple literatures. So there's some that look at geographic determinants, and I'll discuss a couple of those in a bit. There's some that look at institutional determinants. So, those kind of legal or political institutions a society has. Shahid mentioned my book, Rulers, Religion, and Riches. That's largely an institutional story and something we discuss, of one of many theses that we discuss in the book. There's another one that's cultural. And, we should be clear what we mean by cultural up front. This is not a statement that some cultures are, either better or worse at producing wealth or anything of that nature. It's more, the way that people see the world, the way that they view others. So things like trust in others is it's very much considered a cultural attribute that differs widely across the world and has massive economic implications. So those are the types of things we discuss there. Then there's demographic explanations. So, birth and death rates, that have been largely viewed, certainly in the pre-industrial world, as being key to understanding why some parts were a little wealthier than others. And the final one is colonialism. So there we look both at the role that colonialism played in the rise of certain European countries, particularly England, but more importantly, the role that colonialism played in the either delayed catch up or the continued poverty of certain parts of the world that were colonized. That's the first half of the book. The latter half then goes into, well, what happened? What happened particularly, you do have to explain what happened in England. This is where industrialization happened. It's where the first modern economy emerged. And then how did it spread? How did that spread to places like the United States, and Canada, and then, in Western Europe. And then eventually, we talk about East Asia, and, we talk about South Asia a bit. We talk about, eventually China, because, some of the lessons that we learned from how especially parts of, say, Western Europe originally became rich apply to these other parts of the world. Some don't. So if I had to give you a few sentence upshot of the book, what can we learn from this book? I think by far the most important thing is that there is no silver bullet. This is something that might seem, maybe to some of you might seem obvious. What works in some places is not going to work in other places.
Are your slides supposed to move, or
they're not moving yet?
Okay,
I'm just kind of giving you an overview of the book for now. So there's no silver bullet that precipitates economic growth in every context. While, as I was saying, this might seem obvious to some of you, and I thought this is something I've always thought to be the case. It's nice to see that the literature actually backs it up. This is not something that has been obvious to policymakers, especially over the last 20, 30 years, whether it be World Bank, certainly what was known in the US at least as the Washington Consensus, where you have a few targeted macroeconomic policy objectives and it's supposed to facilitate growth. In some cases it does, but in most cases it doesn't. And you could also say this about stuff like democracy. Democracy is certainly positively and strongly positively correlated with economic growth. But there's two issues with that. One is that it's the relationship is not obviously causal. At least the causal channel might actually run the other way, even though there's been some recent work which does suggest that democracy can lead to growth. And the second is that, just because it has worked in some contexts does not mean it's going to work in every context. So, bringing democracy, say, to Iraq or something like that was, it didn't work to facilitate growth in the way that some thought it would. So that, I think, is one thing. On the other hand, I should say, just because there's no silver bullet, just because there's nothing that works every time a society has it, does not mean that we can't learn anything from the past. There are many features that are common to most growth episodes. And both Mark and I work largely at this kind of intersection of institutions and culture. So I guess in some respects, it's not surprising that we find this kind of interplay between institutions and culture as being really important. But I'll get into that in a bit. And one thing I'm going to say here is for a presentation, I've had to present this book a few times. One thing I'll be doing in this presentation is only showing you figures, because I think that, for presentations on books, especially ones that I think our book has something like 75 figures in it, it's a lot can be said just by looking at figures. And obviously I'll talk over the figures, but I just wanted to warn you about that. All right. So the first things first, is the world rich? Now, it matters what your definition of rich is. So this figure, I think, is just very, we used some historical data on GDP per capita, annual income per capita. How much does the average person make, in terms of their annual income? And what this figure shows are the lighter shaded countries are countries that are richer in terms of GDP per capita than Great Britain was in the year 1800. Now, why is Great Britain in 1800 important? Well, it was the richest country in the world. As you can see, with the exception of sub-Saharan Africa and a few other countries, Afghanistan, North Korea, every country in the world has higher per capita GDP than Great Britain, just after it industrialized, but really before its massive economic takeoff. So what this is suggesting is, I think, many things. First off, we do not think of Great Britain as necessarily being that poor in 1800. Now, to be clear, there was clearly poverty in Great Britain. Another thing that this figure obviously just kind of skims over is that this doesn't say anything about the distribution of income in these countries. So, a place like India has, hundreds of millions of people that are living on the edge of subsistence still, even though the per capita income was higher than Great Britain's in 1800. But the point here is that the wealth that came to Europe, and particularly Northwestern Europe, in the early part of the 19th century, then spread quickly to the rest of Western Europe, parts of North America, Australasia, has spread. It's spread to the rest of the world. Now, again, I want to be very clear. There is a very long way to go. And economic growth is not the only thing we should care about by any means, especially as it does damage to the planet. But on the other hand, as we know in the book, these are things that are not necessarily in conflict with each other either. Economic growth actually is probably one of our best ways to get out of the climate crisis by due to multiple reasons. One is innovation that can help us help solve climate issues. Another thing is, and there's a number of economists that, and I would include myself in this, that think this is among the most important things when it comes to innovation, is just having more and more people that are not concerned with where their next meal is coming from, that actually have, that have the time as children to go to school, and then later in life can, go to university, do the types of things that you would need to do in order to become inventive. As more and more people move away from subsistence, you get a much larger group of people that might have that one-off idea that really helps change the world. So this is why we care about growth. And again, it's not the only thing we care about by any means. In fact, I'm of the persuasion that inequality is just as important as growth. But these two things can also move hand in hand with each other. To give you another idea of just how rich the world has become, this is a admittedly arbitrary statistic, $10 a day. But so the well-known economic historian Deirdre McCloskey uses the term $3 a day as the world standard prior to 1800. So one thing I'll get to when I discuss demography in a little bit is this idea of Malthusian economy that's named after the English pastor Thomas Malthus, who envisioned this world, and he was right up to that point in world history where most people live near subsistence, because anytime you get a one-off increase in economic growth, something like this, eventually more people would come, and more children would be born, and those extra mouths would eat up that surplus, and you'd go right back down to around subsistence, which she put at around $3 a day. Now, again, $10 a day is not rich by modern standards. That's $3,650 a year, and per capita income, that would certainly put you well below poverty levels in the United States, at least. But this is something that, again, almost no society, or very few societies, and certainly not for a prolonged period of time, had achieved in world history. All right, so this is now moving us away from absolute poverty towards something that is still not wealthy, but has some comforts. And as you can see, so that what this figure tells us is when these societies exceeded $10 a day. So the very darkest shade is never, as we just saw in the previous figure, there's still large parts of sub-Saharan Africa and a couple other places that are still poorer than England was, or Great Britain was in 1800. But many other parts of the world moved ahead, and particularly in the 20th century. There are some parts that, were, especially in Europe and North America, that were prior to the 20th century, but much of the rest of the world caught up at least to moderately comfortable levels at some point in the 20th century. And again, I want to stress that this is just an average. This is not a distributional thing, but these are important data, we think. And they're important because they do show real progress, and they show what I think and what we hope is achievable over our lifetimes. What will this figure look like, and in particular, what will the last figure look like in, say, 30 years? Hopefully the entire figure is unshaded in the sense of, or at least not shaded at its darkest level in this figure. All right, so then this next figure is one of the more famous figures, I think, in all of economics. It's known as a hockey stick graph. You can think of a hockey stick or a field hockey stick, on its side, right? That's what it looks like. It's flat, 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 then it shoots right up. All right, what this is it shows you, and these are estimates. To be clear, we don't exactly know what GDP looked like in the year 1 CE, or even 1000. There were no bureaus of statistics or things like this that were collecting these data. These are estimates based on, they're not just pure guesses. We do have some ideas of what people consumed, how much they consumed, how much an average person what they were really able to afford. And I should say, there's obviously a little more variation than it looks here, but for the most part, the qualitative version of this figure holds. What this shows you is yearly per capita income, per capita GDP in a variety of places around the world. And essentially all this is telling us is that there was a takeoff that in some parts of the world, especially, Western Europe, North America, began in the 19th century. And in most other parts of the world began in the 20th century. And what this is telling us is that this is a very modern phenomenon. The things that I just showed you, the parts of the world which are most, with the exception again of parts of sub-Saharan Africa that really are wealthier than the wealthiest part of the world was a little more than 200 years ago, or even a better level of wealth at $10 a day, you still have much of the world at above that now. This is something that's very much a 20th century thing. This is not something that nearly any part of the world had experienced prior to the 19th century. There were, to be clear, there were a few places that had a little more, but like the Italian city-states in the 14th century, possibly parts of China in the 10th and 11th century, possibly parts of South Asia earlier on, but these were sporadic. They did not last. That's the difference between historical, or probably the most important difference between any historical episode of growth and any modern episode, in the modern episodes of growth, is that the modern ones have persisted, and there's every reason to believe they will continue to persist, save disaster, which could happen, of course. All right, so that's that for kind of the motivation. Now I'm going to just go into examples for the rest of this talk about what we're getting at, why these various explanations might fit, and then what the book tells us at the end. So the first set of explanations, so that was chapter 1. Those are figures from chapter 1 I just showed you. The second chapter of the book looks at geographic explanations. And we go through a number of reasons why geography might matter. So climate is one. So where it might be either too hot for people to be productive, it might be either too rainy or not rainy enough. It might be too mountainous. There's a variety of reasons, and disease is another one. So, we have a figure that shows, for instance, Africa's malaria belt. This is, on the one hand, people living in the malaria belt are much more likely to have some type of natural immunity towards malaria, but it's still a debilitating disease, especially when we think about the capacity to really work. And this is something that, as you can see, if you look at the darker the shade here, the higher the risk. The correlation with this and what I just showed you in the last few figures, where it's the places that have not really achieved even Great Britain's level of success in 1800, highly correlated with the malaria belt. So on the one hand, that gives you some idea that at minimum, a correlation is there between certain types of geographical features and economic growth. I want to be very clear, however, that most of the literature we discuss in this book, and really if you want to be published in economics anytime in the last few decades, it's not just about establishing correlations. It's really about establishing causal arguments. And whether these arguments are causal or not are subject to a lot of debate. So another geographical, by far, I think the most famous geographical explanation that's been given in the last few decades is Jared Diamond's explanation in Guns, Germs, and Steel, where he looks, and I'll just show you this figure and I'll explain what's going on in it and why we would see this according to his argument. So he looks at a few things in his, one thing he looks at are the shape of the continental axes. So he notes that Eurasia, from the Iberian Peninsula in the west, more or less, all the way to East Asia, China, Russia, and the east was horizontal. So meaning that you're at the more or less the same latitudes, same set of latitudes for the most part. Whereas if you see Africa, at least especially sub-Saharan Africa, and certainly the Americas are much more in a northwest vertical axis. What he says about this is the one reason that this is important is that, well, there's multiple reasons. So things like grains and certain types of domesticatable animals are less likely to be able to be transported across places with a wide variety of climates, which if you have a northwest axis, you're going to get a lot more variety of climates because you're at different latitudes. Whereas east-west, you have similar climatic conditions unless you're able to spread grains and domesticated animals and domesticated cereals. The other thing, which is what this figure, some other economists have since kind of taken this argument and tested it, is that technologies are much more likely to transfer across an east-west axis rather than a north-south axis, mainly because people are more likely to move across east-west axis than north-south axis. And so when we look at technology levels in the year 1500, more or less before the Columbian expansion, in Europe's expansion to the Americas, you see that Eurasia dominates the technology adoption level. So this is just in terms of how close to the frontier of 1500 technology these societies have. And you see that, it's not just Europe, it's North Africa, it's the Middle East, it's South Asia, it's East Asia. These places were at the technology frontier, more or less, whereas much of the rest of the world was far from it. Again, there are many possible explanations for this, but one thing that is certainly true is that this is highly consistent with Diamond's explanation of this east-west axis. All right, so that was just a taste for a few geographical explanations. There are many more. The book goes over as many of them as we know of there being out there. But I want to move on because there's 10 chapters in this book, and that's just chapter 2. So the third chapter looks at institutions. And what we mean by institutions are, it's like legal institutions, political institutions, religious institutions, all of these things that help dictate, what the Nobel Prize winning economist Douglas North famously called the rules of the game. They kind of dictate the constraints that people face. They impose incentives on people to act in certain ways. And one thing that I think has become clear, at least in this literature, and it goes back to North and before as well, is that political institutions are really important. So, whether you have institutions that provide rule of law, for instance, rule of law is an incredibly important one because it means that people have an idea that others are subject to the law, that no one can really transgress the law to at least to a large degree and get away with it. And what this does is it encourages economic activity, right? That no one's going to come confiscate your goods when you invest in capital, things like that. So, there's plenty of data out there that look at these things. Political scientists in particular are interested in quantifying, which countries have strong rule of law, which countries have weak rule of law. And this is just a scatter plot, again, showing a correlation. With all this figure shows is a correlation. Now, there's plenty of evidence out there that this is causally related. But what this shows is you have the rule of law index on the horizontal axis and per capita income, per capita GDP on the vertical axis. And it's a very obvious positive correlation. All right. Again, this is not to say that this is causal. And in fact, the causality could go the other way as well. And some have argued that it does, whereas, it's wealthy countries then get good rule of law, get good institutions. All right. Now, so we have another way of showing this where we put that same index and just map it out. And again, I think that you can see a visual correlation if you remember, those first few figures that I showed you in terms of where, countries had even historically become wealthy. There is a fairly strong correlation between darker shades here, which we might think of as poor rule of law. The darkest shades have the worst rule of law in terms of people, when I think of rule of law, I think of it meaning it's just there is law and everyone is subject to it. It cannot be transgressed, whether it be at the very highest levels or by people with coercive power, like police officers, things like that. Now in the U.S. today, we're actually seeing an erosion of certain aspects of the rule of law, and this has actually been noted in these indices. And I believe the most recent one, this is when we were originally gathering these data, was 2017. I believe, and the most recent one, the U.S. is a little lower. Again, so this is one of the types of things, and there's many reasons why we would think rule of law would help lead to economic growth. A big one being property rights protection. When we think of what leads to well-functioning markets, what leads to people to want to invest in capital, to invest in being innovative, and we think of there at minimum one necessary, though we would say not sufficient, it's not enough in and of itself, condition would be having protection for things like property rights. All right, another type of institution that has received a lot of play, particularly by a subset of economists, are legal institutions, and particularly the type of law that a society has. So what this, there's these set of papers by Laporte et al., which look at what they call legal origins. Where did a society originally get their modern law from? And now, because of colonialism, so we could have actually thought about this in the context of the colonialism chapter, most legal origins that are ascribed to in the world today are European. And actually, most of them are either English civil law or English common law or French civil law, with a few exceptions. And what this literature notes is something that was relatively good about English law for economic growth, at least, is that it provided investor protection to a much greater degree than French civil law did, meaning that there was much more incentive to invest, much more incentive to have financial innovations that could lead to greater investment. And thus, at least in the parts of the world that took off first, English common law was common to almost all of them. All right, that's just one example. Again, well, everything thus far, I'm not necessarily saying Mark and I subscribe to. What we're just trying to do is give you an idea for what some of the major theories are. Another one, and one that I very much do subscribe to as being important, and this was also, as was noted at the beginning, I had a book that came out about 5 years ago that looked at different political arrangements, particularly in that case, looking at the role that religion played in politics. But one thing that comes out of that is that constraints on executive power really matter, meaning can the executive, the president, the prime minister, just do whatever they want? If they can absolutely do whatever they want, we would think of that as an autocracy with very few constraints on what they can do. Or are they highly constrained? Are there other mechanisms within government that do this, whether it be a legislature, a judiciary, or there might be private interests, especially if those private interests have some degree of coercive power. Historically, that would have been the case. There could be a military that constrains rule, even though when the military constrains rule, we often don't think of that as being great for economic development, because that means you have a highly coercive state. And political scientists have formulated this in what is known as a polity score. So higher numbers here are good in terms of they have more kind of constraint on executive power and a few other important things that political scientists view as being making for good governance. And again, so you have the 2017 polity scores here. You see that while there are certainly outliers in terms of the relationship between their polity score and levels of economic growth, say for instance, India has a higher polity score than the US, even though it's obviously not nearly as wealthy. We don't think of outliers as necessarily being indicative that something doesn't matter. Mongolia would be the same. Has a better polity score than the US, obviously not close to as wealthy as the US. But again, all of these figures are looking pretty similar in terms of, what places either have good institutions, maybe good, in some cases, bad geographic endowments, things like that. Again, so what we're trying to do in this book is, both present this, but also then discern between these things, because, so on the one hand, you say, all right, geography is looking like, all right, it's highly correlative with economic growth. Oh, so are institutions. Well, which one is more primal? Well, that's something we'll discuss. All right. So moving on, chapter 4 then goes into cultural explanations, and there's been a ton out there. Probably the most famous one, I think, at least from this in the social sciences, is Max Weber's Protestant ethic hypothesis, which came out in 1905. He argued that there was a certain quote unquote ethic in specifically the Calvinist brand of Protestantism that encouraged hard work, encouraged grit, whatever you want to call it, that people wanted to show that they were predestined to go to heaven by working hard and being successful on earth. There was another literature that was highly Eurocentric at best, racist at worst, that looked at other parts of the world and said, well, it was something about their culture, including Weber, who looked at the Islamic world and said, well, there were aspects of Islam that were way too conservative, things like this. And, so one thing you can say is, well, in the data, there are correlations. Now, to be very clear, I've obviously, as was mentioned, I've done work on this. There's nothing in my work, and I don't think in most of the work on religion that's been done in the last 10, 20 years, that with the economics of religion, at least, that would specifically ascribe anything about the contents of the religions themselves as mattering. But there are things associated with the religions that might matter, like the role that they play in politics, the role that they play in law. Things like this might matter. So at least we can start with correlations. And as you might be able to see here, some of these lines are a little hard to read, but the lightest line is a correlation between the percentage of people in a country that are Muslim with their per capita GDP. It's slightly negative, whereas for Protestant Catholic, it's slightly positive. Again, this is one that I believe almost every economist and political scientist working on this would not ascribe as causal by any means. But the correlation might be something that needs to be explained. Why do we see this? It's not just something about Islam or Catholicism or various branches of Protestantism. What is it? All right. That's something that, again, we go into in the book. We discuss my work. We actually discuss Mark's work here. Mark also works at the intersection of religion and economic history. So my own theory, or my own thesis, is that the role that religion has played in politics and its unwinding in Europe did play a really important role in at least setting Europe, allowing Europe to go on this path. But for a variety of reasons, it's not just about religion. It's really about, well, who has a seat at the political bargaining table? Is it religious authorities? Or the economic elite? Is it military elite? And really, to the extent that the economic elite end up being completely shut out of the political bargaining table, that's when policies end up not really reflecting the types of things that we might think of as good for economic growth. That's just one of many theses that we discover here. But this chapter is not just about religion; it's about culture as a whole. And I briefly mentioned this at the beginning, but it bears repeating. When we talk about culture here, we really mean it the way that kind of cultural anthropologists use it. It's really about the way that people view the world. And this is at a collective level, typically, the way, when we think about the way that people view the world. So when we discuss this, where we say, all right, how do people say trust each other? Something like this. And trust is something that has been shown again and again to matter for economic development. If you can't trust others, it's highly unlikely, especially trust others that you don't know. If you feel like that people are always, so the question that's asked, that's often asked, that gets us at this is, people who answer, all right, can most people be trusted? This is something at a societal level, we say, all right, there's a wide variety in the way that people answer this question. And as you can see here, at minimum, this correlates strongly with per capita GDP. This, in a sense, is not surprising, even though the causal channels are something we need to think about, because economic activity, especially people you don't know, requires at least some degree of trust. Now, maybe that trust can be spurred on by institutions, but typically economic transactions are sequential. I give you something, I expect money in return. I have to trust that when I give you the good, you're not going to just run off. All right. And again, institutions help facilitate trust, because if there's good political institutions or legal institutions, I know that you'll be punished if you just run away with the goods. But there's also plenty of times where I don't necessarily need institutions to help support that. There are these kind of more softer cultural aspects that can help facilitate all types of transactions without institutions. All right. And again, where does this trust come from? That's the big question. All right. We're not answering that in this chapter, even though we're going to talk about that later. So moving on to chapter 5, which is about demography. So demography, we can say, is both inputs and outputs to economic development. On the well, let's maybe start, since this figures on the output side. We think of demographic outcomes as among the most important for actually showing, well, who's wealthy? What does wealth mean in this context? Life expectancy is one of the most important things that I think one can think about when we think about, well, what makes for a good life? Where life expectancy is really low, that means that people are, generally not healthy. They're probably not living as good of a life. In fact, even though, some of the parts of the world we see here, I think the lowest, at least as of 2015, the lowest life expectancy in the world was around 51 years. We can actually say this is a massive achievement. Throughout, we showed you England as of 1800. I think the places with the longest life expectancy around 1800 were in the upper 30s. About 38 years or so was, I think, the highest life expectancy in the world as of 1800. So every place in the world has higher life expectancy than that now. Some with massively more life expectancy. I believe Japan at least had the highest life expectancy in the world, somewhere in the mid 80s. Now, there are demographic issues that will arise from this, namely, how do you support the people that are no longer working? On the other hand, this is a massive improvement in all sorts of things that we care about as economists, happiness, right? Quality of life. Now, that's kind of a demographic output. A key demographic input, though, is what I described at the beginning, is this idea of Malthusian economy. Now, in a Malthusian economy, we'd say that as income goes up, you're eventually going to have more children, and those children will eat up all of the extra surplus. So one would expect to see that there's going to be no long run real advances, and that is what we see. We also would expect to see there being an inverse relationship between population size and per capita income, or in this case, wages. So one thing that is commonly used in this literature as kind of a quote unquote natural experiment is the Black Death. The Black Death killed large parts of Eurasia. It killed, depending on where you look in Europe, it killed up over half of the population of certain countries. It did similar things in the Middle East and East Asia. And so what we say, all right, this was a massive demographic shock. How did it affect wages? We'd expect, as labor supply shifts down, wages should shift up. This is precisely what we see. I mean, these two lines, one of which is population, one of which is the real wages of in agriculture, are very clearly inversely related. When one goes up, the other goes down. All right. And the reason you get such a dramatic decline in population in the 14th century is the Black Death. All right. So it's only when the population finally rebounds in the 16th and then in the 17th century that you actually see wages go down. Right. So the real wage of workers in the late 14th and 15th centuries was much higher than it was centuries later in England. It was only with industrialization and its aftermath that those wages would start to rise again. You see something similar here with fertility. And so one thing that's one theory on why Northwestern Europe eventually became the first to industrialize is what is known as the European marriage pattern. So typically around the world, the way these Malthusian dynamics work is that once, particularly women, entered into marriage, they would just essentially have as many kids as they could feed until they no longer were no longer fertile. And obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but typically in world history, no matter where you were in the world, many children would not make it out of childhood. So many women would have up to say 10 children, maybe five or six of which would make it to adulthood. But one thing that was slightly different about Northwestern Europe is that the age of marriage was typically a few years later than at least anywhere else in Europe, and really, as far as we know, anywhere else in the world. So it was mid to late 20s was typical of medieval European women, which meant that they had fewer children because they had fewer childbearing years in which they were married, again, on average. What this means is that wages were, even prior to industrialization, a little higher in Europe. Now, what eventually happened, as you can see here, the dashed line is female age of marriage. In the 18th century, and particularly even on the eve of industrialization, the female age of marriage started to decline. And what you would see is because of that, the birth rate went up. Now, in England, what ended up happening with industrialization, which I'll show you in a second, is that industrialization did not immediately lead to economic development. The most immediate thing that happened was the population expanded. As there became much greater productivity, much higher overall GDP, that just initially mostly went into more mouths to feed. It was only in the 19th century that we see this correlation breaking just a little bit. All right, the final kind of chapter that overviews this literature is on colonization. And as I'm sure you're somewhat aware of, this little part of Northwestern, rather Western Europe, went from England down to Spain, colonized most of the rest of the world in terms of its landmass. If you included the Russian Empire and maybe the Ottoman empires in there, in terms of empires that did colonization, you'd get most of the world at this point. With the most populous country by far that wasn't colonized was China, of course, but really this little part of Europe colonized at some point most of the rest of the world. There has been a large literature on why this might have affected economic growth in those parts of Europe. That is a literature that's highly contentious. There's a large set of economists that believe that industrialization would have looked quite a bit different without colonization, but still would have happened. Because the links connecting colonization to, say, things like the slave trade, or say Egyptian or South Asian cotton, are not as strong as one might suspect. On the other hand, what it has been, I think, highly convincing literature is that the colonization had a dampening effect on the economic development of large parts of the former colonized world. This is something that is now, especially with more and more data that has come in the last 20 years, has really been shown to be the case. So for instance, probably the most pernicious aspect of, the most pernicious aspect of colonization is the slave trade. Where millions of Africans were taken to, at least in the transatlantic slave trade, to the Americas, both to the U.S. South, the Caribbean, South America, particularly Brazil was a large slaveholding colony. And this data is from Nathan Nunn. It's a very famous paper on the effects of the slave trade on African economic development. And he finds an extremely strong correlation, which which he's able to argue both statistically and also just through narrative, as being highly causal in terms of where slaves were taken. Those parts of Africa have remained poor, and actually in the 20th century, there continued to be a divergence between the parts of Africa that had relatively few slaves taken and those that had many slaves taken. And there's a variety of reasons why this is the case. A big one that he's looked at in other contexts is trust. Where slaves were often taken by their neighbors or by neighboring groups in raids, because these raids were very, you take them to port, the Europeans would pay you in guns for the most part, which would then help you take even more. And what this did is it created this environment where people just did not trust each other. And this environment has persisted to the present day, where you had many slaves taken in the past. There are much lower levels of trust today. Again, this is something that we know is highly correlated and probably causally correlated with economic growth. This is just one of many examples we give in this book of colonization rearing its head in terms of not necessarily facilitating European growth. Again, that's contentious, and we don't necessarily fall on one side or the other there, but it certainly slowed growth in other parts of the world, and it slowed catch-up growth in other parts of the world, catching up with the frontier that was Europe, now North America and other places. All right, so that's the first half of the book. I'll go for a few more minutes here, and then I guess I can open it up. The latter half of the book is then tries to explain, well, what happened. And to understand what happened, we need to understand what happened in England first, and then how growth spread to the rest of the world. Now, in England had this kind of constellation of things that came together, and as you can see here, their per capita GDP, wasn't, look at this figure. This gives per capita GDP of select countries. One of which I think focus maybe on Great Britain and China. So they're the two dashed lines. Great Britain is a heavier dashed line. China is the same type of dash, but lighter. As of 1450, more or less the same per capita GDP. Even as late as 1650, more or less the same. You start to see takeoff in the latter half of the 17th century. And then in the 18th century, even prior to industrialization, there is a big takeoff. With industrialization, the divergence becomes enormous. All right, so then the question is, why did this happen? What were the types of things that might have been present in England that weren't present elsewhere? And this is where I think one of the most important, I said at the very beginning, there's no silver bullet. There happened to be a constellation of things that happened in this particular context of Great Britain. It did have, by the end of the 17th century at least, relatively good, quote unquote, political institutions, those that constrained executive power. For instance, there's a large literature on why this happened, as it did in Great Britain. There's a large, or not a large, but one of the most famous economic historians of technology, Joel Moynier, notes that there was a European-wide culture that had emerged during the Enlightenment that really celebrated the spread of ideas, that really celebrated what he calls a culture of growth, that really celebrated this idea that technology could be used for the betterment of humankind, in that, what he calls the industrial enlightenment. This wasn't just something that was theoretical, it was actually something that was employed by people that worked with their hands, that were the craftsmen that ended up being the really important people for Britain's industrialization. These were things that came together that, different parts of the world had elements of this. So, Song China, in the 11th century, say, certainly had elements of this. They had a number of very skilled people. They had trade, they had markets. Abbasid Iraq, in the 9th century, had many of these elements. One thing that both those places did not have was relatively limited government, which does kind of lead us to believe that, at least for the initial takeoff, some degree of limited governance was probably necessary. Now, clearly, it's not always necessary, because China in the 21st century and late 20th century does not have limited governance by most metrics, yet it has taken off. But we'll consider that in a second. So one thing we can say then is that there were a constellation of things that happened in Great Britain in the 18th and then even into the 19th centuries, that all of which together helped it take off. Now, one thing we can say again, as I mentioned before, is that just because there's a takeoff in overall GDP, as you can see this, huge shoot up, which is the top graph, which is GDP per capita slowed down, or was not as quick to take off in England in this period. And even by 1870, you certainly see it's upticking. It's no longer at these kind of historic lows in terms of, you're always at $3 a day or something like this. But with GDP growth came population growth. So, on the average person was not necessarily that much better off. And really, this was going to be a late 19th century phenomenon where there's a massive takeoff. We see a similar thing with wages in England, even by 1870, which we certainly think we're now getting into what historians call the second industrial revolution. It's only in the latter half of the 19th century that we really see wages start to rise. All right. Now, there's a variety of reasons for this. One of which is demographic, as we've already noted. There were Malthusian forces at play here. One thing that happened with England is, yes, as you get you do get higher GDP, but you also get a much higher birth rate. And it's only at the very end of this figure here, in let's say the mid 19th century, that we see the birth rate start to decrease. So one thing that has become quite clear is it's very hard to maintain persistent economic growth while having a very high birth rate. Just getting your birth rate down is not nearly enough to facilitate economic growth, but it's certainly something that is now viewed as kind of necessary for this to happen. Now, with England's industrialization, we see it, and there's a variety of explanations out there in the literature for it. It's mainly a technological phenomenon. So the question then becomes, well, what makes a society more or less technologically progressive than others? And again, we see political institutions as mattering, certainly having some protections for property rights, for for one's own personal safety, things like this is really mattering. Demographic factors, as we've noted here, end up mattering. And to some extent, even though it's harder to quantify, culture matters, right? There's this idea that when one is innovating, that it might actually lead to progress. This is something that again, came about during the Enlightenment. And I think Moicare has been fairly convincing in showing that this at least is highly correlative to the types of advancements, especially and eventually in science, that we see as being really important in the latter half of the 19th century. Now, one thing that happens with demography is that we start to see this massive decline in the 19th century across the places that became rich in the 19th century. Western Europe in particular, but also even in the US. France was actually the first one to go through what is known as a demographic transition. But as these countries started to become rich, they also went through this transition where women had fewer children. And again, this is something that has been shown, I think convincingly so, to be important to allow these types of income shocks to persist. Again, it's not hardly a silver bullet. Now, what we then do is say, all right, well, how did what happened in England in particular, and to a lesser extent, the Netherlands, get spread to the rest of the world? Well, it certainly did. This is gives you an idea of shares of world industrial output. We go over briefly the US case. The US clearly becomes the world's leading economy in the late 19th and then certainly into the 20th century, both on industrial production and then eventually just, well, actually by this point, per capita income as well. And, we cite multiple reasons in terms of stuff we've already cited, so for one, again, relatively good institutions. Again, US institutions, and same with British institutions, were far from perfect. There was plenty of corruption in both, but there were also limits to that corruption as well. The types of cultural attributes that you might think of as being necessary in Britain were more easily transmitted to the US given its British heritage. Certainly, as we noted in the last figure, demographic features certainly by the late 19th century were working in the US's favor in terms of children per capita. Now, in the US, there is yet another aspect, which is harped on by US economic historians, that the US had a lot of land, meaning that once there were no real population pressures like there were elsewhere. Whenever population started to expand in a certain area, well, you could always move west. And this was true of the entirety of the 19th century. All right, so what the last chapter does is that then it looks at the rest of the world, especially the parts of the world that started to become wealthy in the 20th century, and how this has spread to the rest of the world, and moreover, and for us, much more importantly, why it has not spread to certain parts of the world. Now, one thing that has been fairly common, even though, again, it's not a silver bullet by any means, is limits on governance. So, all right, so one thing you see here are, comparisons between, what are known as the East Asian tigers, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, you can throw Taiwan in there as well. And, really the world's leading economies for centuries prior, India, China, there was a massive takeoff in the latter part of the 20th century between the quote unquote tigers. Now, places like South Korea were a dictatorship. Singapore too, at the time of, at least initially, of their takeoff. One thing we note though, or rather two things we note though that were key to these economies. One is that there were other types of constraints on executive power. In South Korea, interestingly, it ended up being private enterprise that ended up constraining the government. And eventually, South Korea became a democracy. Another thing that is quite important is that and this is, I think, among the most important things, and we're certainly not the first to say this, is that in the 20th and then now, certainly more importantly in the 21st century, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. You don't need to do what England did in the late 18th and 19th centuries to become wealthy. You can engage in international trade, as most countries that are trying to become wealthy do. The world is obviously much more globalized than it ever has been. And that's one of the big lessons the East Asian tigers is these were relatively small economies, both in terms of people, especially in a place, like Singapore, Hong Kong. I mean, these are actually just geographically very small places. And they did not have big enough markets in and of themselves to become wealthy by just feeding a domestic market. So not feeding, don't take that literally, it doesn't necessarily mean agriculture, but that is one other difference between, say, Great Britain and the Netherlands. The Netherlands had been the world's leading economy up until, really the mid 18th century, between, for about 150 years, but the Netherlands was quite small and needed to engage in trade. One thing that Great Britain had, and certainly the US had, was a very large domestic market, which meant that it could have actually some protections for certain types of domestic producers and still become wealthy. Places like Hong Kong, Singapore couldn't do that. They were just too small. But again, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. What you can do is just engage in international trade. And that's what these countries did. They became highly specialized. Eventually, these economic elites were able to constrain the political elites, and these things ended up becoming a virtuous cycle. And these countries became quite wealthy and are now among the wealthiest in the world, and among the most technologically progressive in the world. One outcome that we show that we would say is certainly on the right track, even though there's a long way to go, are those percentage of people living in India that are living in extreme poverty. These are just, these data show various levels of what one might think of as extreme poverty. Now, international economists use $1.90 a day as, the worst of extreme poverty. If you're below that, you really are on the precipice of starving every day. Around 10% of the world lives at that rate today. So obviously that's, at least for us, and I think this is why many people get into economics in the first place, is understanding, well, how can we alleviate that? Now, one thing that's happened in India, even though, again, there's a far way to go, is that there's been a massive drop-off in the number of people in the absolute worst conditions. Now, as you can see from this figure, it's still around 20%. And this was only for 2011, that number's dropped a little bit since then. Whereas, even by 1975, it was right around, 60, around 2/3 of people living in India were living in the worst of extreme poverty. That's massive progress. Again, there's a long way to go. And as you can see from this top number here, living on less than $5.50 a day, there's been some drop in that, but it's still, right around 90% of people are living at what we would still consider very poor wages. But again, that's moving us at least a little bit away from the worst of poverty. And one thing we are hoping to do with this book is think about what are the mechanisms through which people living in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, other parts of the world where there still is a large prevalence of absolute poverty. How can we move them away from this? And again, the ideas are two. One, no silver bullet. Two, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are many mechanisms through which countries can engage in modern economic development. Of course, a place like India has a massive domestic market, so it's going to be a little different than a place like Singapore, right? We see this here as well. What happened in East Asia really was a takeoff that was not even predicted, at the time that the takeoff began. This came as a surprise to development economists, as you can see here. In comparison to Latin America, or in comparison to sub-Saharan Africa, you go back to 1960. These three countries were just more or less just as wealthy as sub-Saharan Africa. Since then, the divergence has been very obvious. And it's really taken off since, say, the late 70s, early 80s. And this is even true of Latin America as well. Again, this just gives you an idea of what can happen. And, so we certainly want to take these as examples of what can we learn about economic growth in a very different environment than the European one, but one that is also, very much engaged in world trade. As I just noted, though, on the other hand, you don't want to take this too far, because there are certain characteristics that are unique to these. They were also, they were close to each other. They were close to large markets, especially the Chinese market. So one thing that economists have noted, and we note in the book, is that, had, say, Singapore been located, had every similar attribute except located off the coast of Africa, it probably wouldn't have grown like it did, because one thing that was really important was that it had access to these growing markets that were close by. So again, no silver bullets. I'll repeat that again and again. All right, so this is the last slide, and this is just, a kind of, I think, the big question that economists are trying to grapple with. And I don't think there's necessarily a great answer. What history can tell us about why China has been able to take off? And it's certainly one of the great economic achievements of the last 40 years. It's brought more people out of poverty than just about absolute poverty than just about anything. There's 1.5 billion people living in China. I'll take questions in a second. This is the last slide. And how has this happened? Because one thing that is, very obviously well known is that China does not have nearly any types of constraints on executive power. The Communist Party, if you're not a part of it, if you try to subvert it, you're probably not going to last that long. So how did this happen? Well, we have to take other aspects of what have we learned from the past. How can China is now becoming technologically progressive. This is also something that's somewhat unique to these follower countries. It typically only happens after you become wealthy that you become technologically progressive. China overall's GDP is high, but it's still well behind the world's leading economies. So these are the types of questions that we pose at the end. We have some thoughts on why this was the case. Certainly there's demographic aspects. There are cultural aspects, particularly views towards education, that we view as being important. But again, we're just kind of trying to scratch the surface, trying to say these are the types of things in history that have mattered. How can we apply it to China? And then how can we apply it to other parts of the world to understand what types of things might we want to invest in? What types of things, do we really need to think about might be specific to a certain cultural context that might not matter in others, or might not have mattered in the past, but might matter now? And I think, I'll leave these as open questions now, and I can, kind of take some questions as we progress. So I'll end there.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. Thank you for this very nice presentation. And we have a few questions.
Sure.
The first one is Dr. Manzoor. So Dr. Manzoor, please go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much for an excellent overview. Just two comments. I know you gave several factors, why some countries became rich, but I think two stood up. One was, whether you look at 500 years, that last 50 years, those which opened up to trade, international trade, took off. And the other, perhaps, I don't know, maybe I'd like to know from you, those who were able to get rid of their dogmatic approach. I mean,
Yeah.
became reformed religiously. So
Yeah.
that was another big factor. I know you mentioned several others, but countries like China, etc., which other things didn't change really. But these two things changed, and they, I think they have become much richer. So, like your comments on this.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that certainly when we talk about the kind of loss of the dogmatic approach, as you frame it, I mean, this is essentially my thesis from my last book is that, and I want to be clear, I don't view this as the only thing that matters for economic growth, but I do think that when we look at why certain parts of the world did not become rich, even though they might have had other features that would have placed them in a position to, that's what we should look for. So keeping onto either, as you call it, a dogmatic approach, or really having religion play an important role in politics, or even in the case of China, there's now a large literature that's emerging on the importance of the old Confucian texts, because that was how you really needed to study that to become part of the bureaucracy, which ended up being the way of advancement. Well, this didn't really actually do much for economic development, because these were old kind of philosophical texts that the best minds were thinking about. So yeah, I mean, I do think that removing those types of elements certainly helps. And I think that, again, I don't think anything's necessarily a sufficient condition, but I think that almost in all cases it's necessary. And certainly in the 21st century, it's going to be very hard, and I'd even say in the 20th century, it's going to be very hard to envision a country that is currently not wealthy becoming wealthy without seriously engaging in international trade. Now, the original countries that, the original path to wealth was through technological development. This was true in Great Britain. It was true in parts of Northwestern Europe. It was certainly true in the US. And it's really the sauce that has made the world economy grow. That said, once a technological frontier moved out significantly, and it continues to move out significantly, it's not necessary, at least initially, for a country to be producing on the frontier. What matters is that they can adopt on the frontier and then engage with world trade in other aspects. So I also completely agree with you that in the 21st century, at least, engaging in international trade is a necessary condition. Again, not sufficient, because there are plenty of countries that do engage in international trade today that are not wealthy, particularly ones that are kind of lower on the supply chain, ones that are not really producing final goods for market. But that can also be a path to eventually getting there. So yes, I agree with you that one thing we at least tried to do in the first half of this book is not place too much primacy on anything. We wanted to just present each theory as the authors would want themselves. But yes, towards the second half, we do kind of favor some versus others. And I would agree with you that those are two of the most important, for sure.
Thank you. Zahid Asghar, Dr. Zahid Asghar, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Jared, for this very useful and interactive discussion. I have a couple of questions or queries. Is it important for a country to go to attract investment like China did, or it's important to have institution building first and then go for you see, right, as you have how China escaped poverty and China's Gilded Age. Second thing is that our analysis was your analysis was mainly based on ecological correlations, means those were basically countries' averages, right? You were taking all those measures as an average. When you split it into further categories, for example, if we split corruption into 4 categories, or if we have a political institution score, and will your analysis change? Third thing, that is it geography which matters, and is Pakistan located on wrong side of the geography? Because you see, now Samsung and all those have started moving towards Vietnam, right? We have on one side Afghanistan, on the other side hilly area of China. We don't have good ties with India, and the other side is right, Iran's that area is not developed. how geography, whereas we see in Europe that all those European countries which were located close to each other, they basically developed, whereas Africa remained poor because all those remained poor. So is it geography, your neighbors and all that really matter? And final one minor comment, in your dual axis charts, basically you have used scales at your own choice, right?
Mm-hmm.
In that way, your graph was basically not depicting the situation which it should be. For example, on one side, you are starting it from 23 to 26. Another side, you are starting from 27 to 36. Right. In that way, we should have, will your analysis change if we change those graphs axis values as per standard data visualization practices? Thank you. Thank you.
Ooh, so a lot there. So maybe I'll go in reverse order. So the last one, yeah. I mean, we do the axes to kind of just make the correlations clearer, because if you allow for a wide range of different values, you're just going to get everything really scrunched up. That's really the only reason. Everything we did in this book was just to try to make the points as clear as possible. But yeah, and everything we showed, they're all correlation. It's just correlations. We're not. For the most part, we weren't trying to make any causal points with these figures. The causal points come in the in the text of the book, which I tried to kind of overlay here. So I'll then take your question on Pakistan and its geography. I have a lot to say on this. So first off, one point that I have made in other works, and I think others have certainly made as well, is that geography is by no means destiny. So this is where I would, even Diamond wouldn't say it is, but I would disagree with Diamond, because one thing we've seen in that geography has a really hard time explaining are reversals of fortunes in the world. Western Europe was well behind the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia for a very long time, especially after the fall of the Roman Empire. And one thing about geography is it doesn't change a ton. Now, one thing you asked about, which I think is more important, is what we might call economic geography. Who are you near? Like, what are your potential trade partners? And I did mention at the very end, places like the East Asian tigers, economic geography mattered a lot for them because they were able to trade kind of more locally. That said, I think that the world is much more interconnected even now, where you have, a place like Bangladesh is actually starting to grow. And it is starting to grow as being, kind of, again, lower on the kind of supply chain, but it's supplying stuff to the rest of the world. It's not necessarily just for localized markets or markets around it. It's made, stuff that's made in Bangladesh is supplied throughout the world. And I would say that with a more internationalized market, geography matters less. This is absolutely not to say that it doesn't matter at all. And certainly, when we say, when you say Pakistan has bad ties with India, which is obvious, this is also, that's not a geographical thing too, right? That's more of, it's that's a historical thing, it's an institutional thing, it's a religious thing that that can be ameliorated even if the geography doesn't change. Right. And that would be a great thing for humanity, I believe, if the ties became much better for many reasons. Nuclear proliferation being probably the most important of them. But that's something where I'd say that, I think that if you could kind of just imagine Pakistan moving to a different, maybe off, right off the coast of China or something, as being that might be a little more advantageous. But it also, I think that the geography much more so than other things can be overcome. Whereas we'd say if you have bad political institutions, you need to change those in order to really get growth. Whereas geography is just something that is there and has been shown to be overcomable. Now, now it's been a while. Can you briefly remind me of your first question?
It was about the averages. It was about the averages while developing the graphs and presenting the insights.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. So I think as a whole, so most of these figures were about per capita GDP or things like this that you're absolutely right, of course, are just averages. And depending on what you want to look at, that is appropriate. In some cases, it's not. When we're trying to think about, say, the fraction of people that are living below a certain level of poverty, well, you take a place like China, which has had massive, growth in per capita GDP. Well, 10% of Chinese are still at a very, very low level, and 10% of Chinese is a lot. It's 150 million people. So if we were to break those data down by percentiles or things like this, yes, you would get a different story. Now, one reason we don't do that is that well, there's multiple reasons. One is just for presentation purposes. Another one is that as you go back in history, getting type of distributional data is really hard. We just don't have those data historically. But we actually do make the case throughout the text of the book, at least multiple times, that look, we are just showing averages here. We don't want to just be concerned with averages. Averages do tell us something, but they are not the whole story. And I think we would 100% agree with you that there is much more to the story than just averages. And it's really, when we think about what the big issues are, it's really about alleviating the poverty of those bottom, say 10% or 20% or whatever you want to say. So yeah, no, we'd agree with you on that we're not getting the whole story. And in some cases, it's really hard to show that in the data.
Okay. Well, this is good to sit through this talk. And I wish we had much more time to talk about this important. I actually teach history of economic thought myself, and we start at a different point, which basically is that why was East more developed, let's say from 8th, 9th century to 17th, 18th century, and West was not. And if I apply your narrative, I would say, on that, then I may have, or you may, if you apply that, if you reduce your insistence on the hockey stick, you see, this is a topic on which we spend a lot of time, and we have a lot of work done in South Asia to kind of prove that this hockey stick is actually overplayed. And if you do that, once you do that, then I think the situation could be somewhat different. So we don't perhaps have time to go to a long discussion or debate on that. We may have some other opportunities on that. We developed our course for history of economic thought dialectically with the way you have presented, for example, or the typical Euro-centric economic history of the world is done. And then the second point, that is the periodization of the subject matter. Now, for me, it starts much earlier than before. As I said earlier, that for me, the first question to be treated is that did we have the kind of internal trade, domestic market integration, international trade, credit institutions, trust, all those things under the Mughals and Ottomans or not? And who was trading more even in 18th century, and the kind of exports which were going, I mean, even art pieces were being exported from South Asia to Europe in 18th and 19th century. There's a French guy who has written excellent work on that. So one major issue that I had with your way of organizing things is that you have such a wide brush from 1500 to 2022. Now that, and that is also perhaps the reason that, you had more questions on from the modern period, I mean, what can Pakistan do now, and what is the role of trade, blah, 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 etc. I would like to keep my interest to the economic history as a discipline, and history is always problematic. I go more with the French historians, particularly Bourdelle, in periodizing, where I would put the inflection point somewhere in 1800 and then study what how the difference was created. Another point, you know, these this is the fancy stuff, the correlations and causations and average age of marriage going up in Europe, in UK in particular, at a certain point of time. My French, I actually have a PhD from France in sociology, so my French sources would tell that the average age of marriage in women in UK was due to a high level of absorption of women in prostitution and in the nuns' profession. Now, is it a correlation or causation? Is it due to these two institutions that UK grew? And I also have some serious issue with the life expectancy figure of 38 and 1800 all over the world. But the most important issue, I think I have 11 points, but I'll stop with this one. That is the role of colonialism, the way you have put it. That again is I mean, you are kind and generous to say yourself that it's a contentious point. It's highly contentious, and in South Asia, a lot of work has been done. You know, starting from British anthropologists Gunnar Myrdal, and then the nationalist historians who took the pendulum to the other side. That the nationalist historians would say that India was about to become a modern state had the British not come. And then come the Irfan Habib school on South Asia and all this popular stuff about stagnant villages and the Mughal Empire extracting all the surpluses, and which indirectly supports the hockey stick thing. There is a very, very serious revision which has taken place lately, again in the last 40 years on this subject. And as this is inextricably connected with the British colonial experience. So for me, I mean, we spend a lot of classes and periods on the deindustrialization brought by decolonialism in India, for example, or in the Ottoman Empire, or the role of that in impoverishing, let's say, Ottoman Empire. You see, if you look at the 19th century history, the Muharram Law of 1881, 1854 crisis, and the way the access to the revenue gained by the British companies and the use of mercantilism as a tool of colonialism, particularly in 19th century, not allowing Ottomans to put any kind of restrictions on imports. I can go on and on and on. So I haven't seen your bibliography, but please don't mind my saying so. But we have been trying to develop a more kind of realistic history of economic thought. That's what our main concern, and an economic history of South Asia, including the economic history of those parts which make Pakistan. So it would be excellent to go through your work in a much greater detail, and if you would be interested, I'll get back to you on the first part. My main concern is history of economic thought, the way it is being done and should not be done, or whatever, and constructing an economic history out of the insights, a different economic history out of the insights generated by doing a different kind of economic history. Thank you very much. I hope you have not annoyed you. Thanks very much.
All right. Yeah, thanks. There's a lot there. So, you know, a few things really stuck out of me, and maybe I should make clear. Yeah, so their first point was about kind of the hockey stick graph, and there being, you know, other parts of the world that were, you know, more important or better off than Europe for a long time. Yeah, that's very certainly true. And one thing I want to make clear, and this is also, you know, really how my other book is framed, is, you know, trying to think about, all right, well, if you say, you know, you drop somebody on Earth random, you know, in a random place at the year 1000, they were able to kind of look around the Earth and say, and you would tell them, all right, say 750, 800 years, there's going to be a place that really industrializes, and eventually that would lead to a massive takeoff in economic development. You know, Western Europe would be among the last places in Eurasia where you would expect that to happen. Certainly the Middle East was ahead. Certainly, I mean, this was the kind of the height of medieval Chinese economic development. South Asia was at Eastern Europe, under the Byzantines would have been ahead. So this is certainly something where, we're very aware, and we mentioned this book, but I am certainly in my own work. I mean, this is one of the real puzzles, I think, of economic development. And, when you're right to say, that hockey stick, and I tried to caveat that, and we certainly do in the book, say, look, there's a lot of variation in the flat part. There were parts of the world that were very clearly ahead of Western Europe for a very long time prior to, you say prior to maybe the 16th century, Europe starts to really catch up by that point, I think. And I think though that the real question is though that we're trying to get at here, which is why we motivate it that way, is that there is something fundamentally different about what happened in the 19th century, and then it led to much of the large parts of the rest of the world in the 20th century than anything that had happened before, in terms of wealth spreading to fairly large parts of the population, real incomes rising to levels that they had really never even been close to prior. So that's really what we're trying to explain. That and part of the mystery behind this is precisely the point you bring up, is that for a very long time, it would have not at all been expected that this would have happened where it did. And that's why did it happen there? Why didn't it happen in South Asia would have certainly been a more likely candidate for a very long time than Northwestern Europe. I think the second point, which I'll really, because there was a lot that you said in there, is on colonialism. And I hope I was clear on this, maybe, but I think it bears repeating. I think the massive amount of controversy, and there's a lot that's been done on both sides, is the degree to which colonialism fed into industrialization, meaning so when we ask the question, was colonialism necessary for England to or Britain to industrialize as it did? Well, certainly as it did, it almost certainly was, but was it necessary for it to industrialize? And this is a counterfactual question, which is very difficult to answer, which I think is an important reason why there's been so much back and forth. I think there's actually less controversy on the negative consequences of colonialism for the rest of the world. That has been shown again and again in various contexts, certainly the British colony in South Asia as being largely negative. There's a little controversy in the sense that there's some economists that say, well, the certain colonial powers brought public goods like rail networks and telegraph networks, which is true to the colonies, but for the most part, where good kind of analyses have been able to be done, where whether you can kind of explicitly kind of get some type of counterfactual or anything along this, the consequences not only are shown to be negative at the time, but in most cases they have been shown to persist. That parts of the world that had maybe particularly damaging institutions, or as I mentioned, the case of sub-Saharan Africa, things that might have been particularly pernicious to cultural attributes like trust of others, have been shown to persist. And this is where I think they're really there's many damning legacies of colonialism. I think that it's the economic consequences are certainly among them, because this has been one of the things, I say it's more than just colonialism, but I think colonialism has played a large part in the persistent poverty of many parts of the world. And that's something we do try to cover, especially the literature that has been very good at identifying that the role that colonialism has played. And we've seen this in this literature in certainly in Africa and South Asia. And I to some extent agree with you on the Ottoman Empire as well. This is a part of the world that I've studied, that my previous research has largely been on looking at the Ottoman empires and vis-a-vis Europe as well. And I certainly by the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in a position as essentially to become a almost a vassal state of certain parts of Europe, especially with the types of concessions they had to give, both economic and eventually political. And I think for me, at least, one of the real questions is, why did it come to that, especially when the Ottoman Empire was so powerful, both militarily and economically, throughout much of its golden years, say under Suleiman, not that long after. So yeah, these are the questions that interest me in terms of how did it come to this. And this goes back to your original point, is why did a certain part of the world that was by no means obviously going to be the place where real economic growth took off, why did it come to that there?
Dr. Rubin, thank you so much for being with us. It was an honor and pleasure again to have you with us, talk about this very important topic, and a very nice presentation. And of course, we both have catching up to do. I'll catch up with you later, but I just wanted this presentation to take place. Thank you again. Thank you all for coming, and bye-bye.
Wonderful. Thank you all.
Thank you.